works. It does work. All right. All right, Shabbosai, good morning. Good morning. Beautiful daf ahead of us today. Begin by thanking our sponsors for this morning's shir. To thank Stephen Tarizin for dedicating all of his Sherman drushos this month in memory of Tzvi Hirsch ben Yosef HaKohen. To thank Paul and Kathy Pollack for dedicating all of Sherman drushos this month in memory of Paul's grandparents, Zechariah ben Zechariah and Dina Bas Pesach. To thank our week of learning sponsors, Avi and Vivian Zeisman, the creation of the yard site of Michael ben Yechiel, Zechron Livracha. We hope that in the merit of our Talmud Torah, all of the neshamas will have an aliyah and the families in a chamra. So with that, let us begin. A lot to do today, Meretz Hashem. So we left off. Today's daf is Nun Gimel 53, and we left off on Nun Beis Amud Beis. Lifshot Mina, which is 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 13 lines up from the bottom. So first of all, I do want to thank all of the doctors in the shir, because I got a lot of very good information and good feedback yesterday from some things we discussed. First of all, I thank you to Dr. Rosenblum, who taught me that a limb that is rotting on a person who is still alive is called a necrotic limb. A necrotic limb. Incredible. So we'll say that is good to know. Second of all, the other major ha'ara, this was Dr. Schwartz, Dr. Gevant, pointed this out to me yesterday. I was using the word for shedra as spinal cord. So the truth is, it's not really the spinal cord, rather we're referring to the spinal column. Spinal column. So again, just I knew many people couldn't sleep last night, so I wanted just to highlight this again. Again, just Dr. Schwartz gave me a good. He said spinal cord. I think you're referring to the bones of the spinal column rather than the neurological structure referred to as the spinal cord. So again, Dr. Gevant also emailed me the same thing or texted me the same thing. So I'll say tremendous shkoyach. I think the doctors were looking for CME credits. That's what I happen to think. But good. A tremendous hashkata. I want to say it's beautiful. It's always, the truth is, it happens to be, it's the beauty of Torah, when ultimately, again, you can bring Mada, and this is literally Mada. We have to have a little bit of science, not a little bit, a lot of science over here in order to help us understand things better. So tremendous yeshka. So also with that, let us begin. Remember, we left off yesterday in the middle of a very important question, which is, the Mishnah is going through the list of items that ultimately make a Nazir Tameh. And one of the examples was the Shedra of the Gilgoles, the skull and the spinal column. So I'll say, so the shaila was, is this Shedra and Gilgoles, or Shedra or Gilgoles? This was the fundamental question. Obviously, that's a major nafkamina. So we spent pretty much all of yesterday trying to resolve that particular question without success yet. So I'll say we kind of left off in the middle. The Gemara says, Shiny Shammai de Machmir. Ultimately, so Beis Shammai, when talking about the amount of bones that go ahead and convey Tumah, Beis Shammai was Machmir. To which the Gemara said, I will at least live shot mina, taima de Beis Shammai, the Machmir, harabanan adiika shedra vigilgoles. So the Gemara wanted to suggest that if Shammai is Machmir, at least what I can understand from this Ravosai is what? That maybe Beis Hillel, therefore, who is quote unquote Mekel, will say that a Nazir only contracts Tumah if both the spinal column and the skull are both intact. Maybe not. Could very well be that the Rabbana only argue on Shammai one. Maybe they only argue about in the following case. When it's a bone that comes from the Shedra or Gilgoles. But ultimately, again, when you have a fully intact Shedra or Gilgoles, afilu bechad minhon. Maybe even one of them by themselves has the ability to convey tumah. Okay, we'll say 7 lines up from the bottom. Rova atzamos min Shedra Gilgoles mo. Mai. So Rabbi Shmuel asks as follows: what happens if you have a quarter kav of bones from the Shedra or a Gilgoles? What is that? Understand. Normally, the Mishnah, we're talking about the amount of bones which go ahead and convey tumah. How much bones, right, do you need in order to convey tumah? Generally, it's a half a kav. A half a kav. So what about a quarter of kav of bones from the shedra or gilgolas? To which the Gemara says, so what's the halacha? Mai, kikatoni chatzi kav atzamos. When we say that you need a half a kav of bones, heicha di'ika mishari varav. Maybe that's only bones from the rest of the body. Aval min shedra v'gilgolas techamiri afilu rova atzamos. But I will say maybe again when it comes to the shedra and gilgolas, maybe Rabbi will say under those circumstances, all you need is a quarter kav. In other words, what the Gemara is suggesting over here is that maybe we already see that the shedra and gilgolas are treated differently in terms of hilchos tumah. Maybe an additional difference is that whereas from the rest of the body, you need a half a kav of bones, from the shedra and gilgolas, maybe you only need a quarter kav of bones. So aval min shedra goes to chamiri, afi the rova atzamos odram oloshna. Or maybe there's no difference. Maybe bones are bones, and therefore halacha l'maaseh again, the only amount of bones that are going to create a tumah problem is a half a kav. Amar Rava says tashma hashidra v'hal gilgolas. So I'll say ultimately again when we say that exposure to a shidra and gilgolas require a Nazir to shave and to restart his ned and nazirus. So we'll say that's the statement. And if you think that by shedra and gilgolas, even a quarter a kav of bones go ahead and cause the Nazir to go ahead and shave, listni al rova atzamos haba min shedra. So go ahead, I will say, and let it write, and a quarter kav of bones that come from the shedra. And I will say, ultimately again, the fact that the Mishnah does not say that indicates to us what? That the amount of bones from the shedra and gilgolas that cause tumah is the same amount of bones in general that apply everywhere else, which is a half a kav. A half a kav. Tap of nun gimel. I v'haravahu da'amar lo nitzrucha ela l'shedra v'gilgolas she'ein bahen rova atzamos. But Rav himself said that again, the entire point of his teaching was to teach us the idea about a shedra and the gilgolas, where there's not a quarter a kav of bones. In other words, I will say, according to Rava, the whole chap was shedra and gilgolas pose a tumah problem, even if they don't reach the threshold of a quarter kav of bones. To which the Gemara says, you're right. That Allah l'maisa basar d'shamei Rabbi Akiva. This was stated ultimately again after he heard the statement from Rabbi Akiva. Fine. So Tashma. So we'll say, so again, we're still dealing with the same question. I will say, so now what we've just done is we've transitioned from one question to another question. In other words, our question, which we'll still have to resolve, ultimately is it Shedra and Gilgolas or Shedra or Gilgolas? Question number 2 now is, the Mishnah tells us that a half a kav of bones poses a tumah problem. What about when it comes to bones from the Shedra and Gilgolas? Is the shear still a half a kav? Or perhaps because Shedra and Gilgolas are clearly treated in a more machmir way than anything else, it's even a quarter a kav. Okay, so that's what we're dealing with now. So Tashma, Shammai Omer, Shammai says, Etzem echa min Shedra min Gilgolas. So we'll say Shammai says, even one bone, ultimately again from the Shedra and Gilgolas, will convey tumah. To which the Gemara says, Shiny Shammai the machmir tvei. So we'll say Shammai is different, right? Because Shammai is very machmir. Okay, well if Shammai is very machmir, that's fine. I will say then. I will say, by the way, if halacha l'maisa, that according to Shammai, that even one bone from the Shedra and Gilgolas goes in and conveys tumah, so of course that's even less than the quarter kav measure. To which the Gemara says, no, Shammai is different because Shammai is exceedingly machmir. Well, okay, if Shammai is exceedingly machmir, so tif shot, the Gemara says, liv shot mina, taimad Shammai de machmiran, hal rabbanon ad ika chatzi kav atzamos. So we'll say, if Shammai is the very machmir opinion, then great. Then I could extrapolate from that what? That the rabbanon themselves hold that halacha l'maisa, you need a half a kav of bones in all cases, even Shedra v'gilgolas. Okay, to which the Gemara says maybe not. Dilma ad kan lo pligi rabbanon alei de Shammai ela be'etzem echad. Maybe the rabbanon are only arguing on Shammai in the case of one bone. Aval berova atzamos afil rabbanon modu. I will say, so maybe they're only arguing in the case of one bone. That Shammai is saying by Shedra and Gilgolas, even one bone will convey Tumah. The Rabbanan are disagreeing, and the Rabbanan are saying no. One bone by itself never just conveys Tumah, but ultimately, again, maybe when it comes to the quarter kav issue, they would agree as well and say that whereas by bones by the rest of the body, you need a half a kav, maybe by bones by the Shedra and Gilgolas, you only need a quarter of a kav. Okay, so still unresolved. Amar Rabbi Eliezer. Zekinim Arishonim, so we'll say the original elders, Miktsasan Hayu Omrim, Chatzi Kav Atzamas, V'Chatzi Lug Dam. V'Chatzi Lug Dam. So we'll say, now listen to this. So the original elders said a half a kav of bones and a half a lug of blood. That's ultimately, again, that lakol. They will say, so what does this mean? Take a quick look at Rashi. Rashi's actually kind of like right across. So Rashi says over here, Rashi says, Rabbi Elazar, Zekinim Rishonim, Miktsasan Hayu Omrim, Chatzi Kav Atzamos V'Chatzi Lug Dam Lakol, Mitame Ba'ohel. So we'll say the original iteration, the original Zekinim, right? They said that ultimately, again, a half a kav of bones and a half a lug of blood will convey Tumas Ohel for everything, meaning Truma, Kodshim, Nazir, Ose Pesach. So we'll say if you're under the same roof with a half a kav of bones or a half a lug of blood, ultimately you will contract Tumas Ohel, and that will invalidate your ability to eat Truma, to eat Kodshim. If you're a Nazir, it'll bring your neder to a crashing halt, and it will preclude you from going and eating Karan Pesach. And I will say, take a quick look at the rush also. This is like the second to last rush. Chatzi kavat amos v'chatzi lug dam lakol. Perish lekol davar ba'inan shir godol af l'truma v'kachim upachos mishir zeh eno metame ba'ohel hames. So we'll say, so this is what we're saying over here. So the original halacha was a half a kav of bones, a half a lug of blood conveys tumas ohel, and invalidates you for everything. Truma, Kodshim, Nazir, Karban Pesach. Okay, now watch this. Rovat Samos or Revius Dam. If you only have a quarter kav of bones and a Revius of blood, lo lakol. It doesn't invalidate you for everything. Okay, what does that mean? We'll say, take a look at Rashi again. Rova v'Revius Dam, right? So a quarter kav of bones, a Revius of blood, doesn't invalidate you for everything. Metame kilomar afilu echad mikulam eno metame. So we'll say, so the way Rashi understands this is, if you have a quarter kav of bones, or ultimately again a revius of dam, it does not make you tame for anything. Take a quick look at the rush. Fine. Actually, not the rush yet. But some said, af rova atzamos uravias dam lakol. Others said that no, even a quarter kav of bones and a revius of dam will make you tummy through tumas ohel for everything. So we'll say, see here this machlokas? Very interesting machlokas. So this is all the original Zekinim, right? The original Zekinim will say, said that Allah Lamaisa, half a kav of bones, half a lug of blood will convey tumas ohel for what? Everything. Lakol, Truma, Kodshim, Nazir, Karban Pesach. When it came to a quarter a kav of bones and a revius of dam, they said ultimately nothing. There was a divergent opinion, a machlokes, a second opinion that said even by a quarter kav of bones and a revius of dam conveys tumas ohel for everything. Okay, fine. Beizin shalacharem. We'll say then a subsequent Beizin came along, and what did they say? They said Amru chatzi kavat amos v'chatzi lug dam lakol. They agreed with the original halacha, namely a half a kav of bones and a half a lug of blood conveyed to us all for everything. Truma, Kodshim, Nazir, Pesach, Rova Atzamos, or Revius Dam, they'll say a quarter kav of bones, or Revius of blood, L'Truma v'Kodshim. Will make a person tamei, that type of exposure will make a person tamei for Truma and Kodshim, avalo l'Nazir v'Osa Pesach, but not for Nazir and not for Osa Pesach. So we'll say, so this was the second iteration of the halacha. Again, second iteration, chatzi kav of bone, half a kav of bones, and half a lug of blood, convey tumas ohel for everything. Truma, kachim, nazir, pesach. Quarter of a kav of bones and a revius of dam, ultimately again only for truma and kachim, but will not create a tuma situation for nazir and osa pesach. Fine. To which the Gemara says, Michti, let's analyze this. Ein hachras shlishis machras. So we'll say, says the Gemara, take a look at the Rush for just a moment. The Rush says, Michti ein hachras shlishis machras perish the bezin shalach arehen l'mashchas u'masnisin. So we'll say, it seems to be that the bezin shalach arehen, namely what we're calling the achras shlishis. Now we'll say, if you look at the formulation of this halacha, what did you have? You had in Lashon over here, the Zekenim Arishonim. Right? So I'll say, what did the Zekenim Arishonim say? Zekenim Arishonim said, half a kav of bones and half a lug of blood convey tumas ohel for everything. Quarter of a kav of bones and revius avdam do nothing. But I'll say that was right. That was one. Two, Miktsasan said even a quarter a kav of bones and revius dam is matame for everything. Then Bezin Shalach Harehen, number 3, they say half a kav of bones, half a lug of blood, convey tumah for everything. And then they said quarter of a kav of bones, revius of dam, convey tumah only for truma kachim. Good. That's it. That's the entirety. So I just want to point out, so michti enach rosh lishis machras. The third iteration, in other words, we'll say the Bezin Shalach Hareyan, the last version of this halacha, doesn't seem to align with the Mishnah. Amar Yaakov bar Idi, mipi Shmuel Amru, mipi Chagai Zechariah Umalachi. So we'll say ultimately again, they were saying this over. Ultimately again, they had a Masorah. This was the Masorah. Ultimately again, that drove the Bezin Shalach Hareyan, and they had a Masorah ultimately again from Chagai, Zechariah, and Malachi. Incredible. So we'll say, so halacha l'maisa, how do we paskin? So we'll say, so very specifically, what I want to point out to you over here is, how do we paskin? How do we paskin ultimately again on Shedra and Gilgolas, right? Because this was the question that's been driving our entire sugya. Is it spinal column and skull together, or is it either or? So I'll just point out to you a very good Rambam to have a look at, which kind of brings this entire sugya together. Ultimately, is the Rambam Hilchos Tumas Meis Halacha Parak Beis Halacha Ches Beis Ches Tumas Meis. The truth is, the Rambam brings this down also in Hilchos Nazirus, but the more comprehensive list of like everything and how it's mitame. Ultimately, again, this is the best way to look at it. So we'll say, so I'll point out to you as follows. So first of all, just let's work backwards. We paskin, I will say, like the Beis Din Shal Acharehen. That's also important. So number one, so I will say, how do we paskin halacha l'maisa in this last sugya? So in this last sugya, we paskin is half a kav of bones and half a lug of blood have the ability to convey tumas ohel, ultimately again for everything. Everything means truma, kachim, nazir, pesach. Quarter of a kav of bones and revius of dam only have the ability to convey tumah for what? For truma and for kachim. That's how you pass halacha l'maisa. What about the spinal column and the skull? So this is what the Rambam says. Hashidra b'agolgolas v'Rabbi Avram Yono hashidra ketzad. What's the case of shidra? What's the case of spinal column? Shidra shehi shlema harei kimei shalem. A fully intact spinal column. Ultimately again is like a corpse. It's like a corpse, and therefore if it's missing even one of the vertebrae, says hagolgolas ketzad. What's the case of a skull? Golgolas shehi shalema. A fully intact skull is like an entire corpse. So as I said, Rambam Paskins, it is not shidra and golgolas together. Rather, it's either or. It's either or. So I'll say that's how you pass halacha l'maisa. You do not need both in order to convey this tumah chamura. Rather, either one fully intact ultimately will operate like a complete mace. Incredible. We'll say, let's go weiter. Let's go weiter. Al ilu nazir migalech. So I'll say, so the Mishnah said, remember after going through the whole list over here, so the Mishnah said these are the types of tumah for which a nazir will have to shave. Of course, I will say, what does shaving mean? So shaving means, again, bringing his current nazirus to an end and restarting a new tenure. So al elu dereisha utemai. So I'll say, I'm sorry, al elu dereisha So we'll say, remember again, whenever you see a lashon like this, al elu for these. So often, the way the Gemara interprets that is that al elu means for these things you will go ahead and become tamei, which we can infer from that as what? For other things you won't become tamei. So al elu, dereisha lemeute etzem kisaora. It comes to exclude the case of a bone fragment that is the size of a wheat kernel. Da'al magao ve'al masao in al ahilo lo. Because we'll say if you have a bone fragment that is the size of a wheat kernel, ultimately if you touch it or if you carry it, you will be chayiv, or chayiv. You will become tamei. But ultimately, again, if you are under the same roof as it, you will not become tamei. Va'al elu the seifa, but ultimately, again, I will say when it comes to elu the seifa, ultimately, again, what does that come to exclude? Lemeute even hasechuches. So we'll say this is actually very interesting. So again, we have over as follows. So we'll say, remember, this is just now a textual inference. Whenever you see the Mishnah says, for these things, a Nazir will have to end his current neder nazirs and begin again. For these means you're coming to exclude something. What are you coming to exclude? Etzem kisora, the very small bone fragment that is the size of a saora, to teach you that what? If you touch it or if you carry it, you will become tamei. But if you are under the same roof as it, you will not become tamei. So that's the first exclusion. Second exclusion of elu the seifa. It also says elu at the end of the Mishnah. What does that come to exclude? Lemeute even hasechuches. So we'll say even hasechuches is a very interesting case. If you take a look at Rashi, Rashi says over here, even mesame. It's the last Rashi on the daf. Even mesame v'zui even shmuteles al gabe meis b'rishus harabim. We'll say the case outside because it's actually quite interesting. Imagine the following situation: you have a corpse. It's lying on the ground. So we'll say what you also have is. Imagine for just a moment, you have a building, you have a house, and you have stones which protrude from the house. Stones which protrude from the house. So we'll say, if you're standing underneath one of those stones with the corpse, what's the halacha? It's ohel. Well, so remember again, tumas ohel doesn't require a fully intact roof. All tumas ohel requires is what? Is some roof-like item on top of you and the mace. So, for example, if I'm standing underneath a stone, say, you can imagine this. Imagine Reuven has a house, right? And what he does is he has stones which protrude from the house. Why does he have stones? He puts a schach on that. So it's not a roof, right? It's not a roof, but let me say it's protrusions. But it's stone protrusions. So now I'm standing underneath the stone with a corpse, right? So I will say that I'm going to contract tumas ohel. The case of Even Mesamer, I will say, is, or Even Hasechuches, as the Gemara calls it, is, let's say again, this house has a number of these stone protrusions, right? Under some of them is a mace and under others is not. I know I walked under one of them. What don't I know? Which one I walked under. So that's my safek case. So I will say, so in a case like this, halacha l'maisa, you would not contract tumas ohel. Again, the lumdis of it, that's what Rashi points out. Even Mesame v'zoi even shemutelas hagabe meis b'shus harabim k'devar Shabbos. Perak Amar Rabbi Akiva, Shema Nazir Yoshev Aleh Afa Pishetim Asa Inu Megalech Aleh. So I'll say so again. This would be a case. Well, we'll actually see this case, create a reference, but later on. But Allah Klamaisa, this is what the Seifa is coming to exclude. So the Reisha is coming to exclude. Ultimately, again, the case of Etzem Kisaora. That ultimately, again, if you're under the same roof, Nazir, if a Nazir is under the same roof as this bone fragment that is only the size of a saora, he will not contract tumas ohel, and the vi'al elu of the seifa is coming to exclude the case of even sechuches. Fine. V'chatzi kavatzamos. So also remember again, if you have a half a kav of bones, ultimately again, this would cause the nazir to contract tumah and require him to shave. Amud beis. Chatzi kavatzamos in. Rova lo. So what do you see from here? Is dafka half a kav of bones, but not a quarter kav of bones. Now take a look at Rashi for just a moment. Rashi says, first Rashi in the daf, chatzi kav atzamos, mitame alav amagov amasov alahilo. So we'll say if you have half a kav of bones, you remember again, there are multiple ways you can become tamei. How could you become tamei? Touch it, right? Carry it, or under the same roof as it. Now, the way it's making it sound over here is, But if you have a quarter of a kav of bones, then what? You won't become tamei at all. Even if what? Even if you touch it. So the Gemara says, hey chidami, what's the case? Ilema de ispahon atzamos kisaora. But I don't understand. I will say it doesn't make any sense. What did we just establish? We established in the Mishnah that if you have a bone fragment, right, that is the size of even like a kernel of barley, what's talacha? You're tamei. Now, granted, you're not tamei tumas ohel, but if you touch that, you are tamei through maga. So if you are going to become tamei through a bone fragment, Rabbi say, then of course what? From a quarter kav of bones, you're going to become tamei as well. Now, granted, I understand. Maybe I won't become tamei through tumas ohel, but lamaisa should at least become tamei through maga. To which the Gemara says, so I understand, when you say that a quarter of a kav of bones doesn't do anything, is not metame, how could that be? In a quarter of a kav of bones, you certainly have at least what? You certainly have at least a bone fragment, obviously, that should convey tuma. Rather, we'll say, what's the case? The case is where you ground up the bones. You ground up the bones. So we'll say, so what do you have? You have bone dust. Right? Take a look at Rashi. Rashi says, "Sheshakakan dak harbe kimokemach shenitchan bo." So we'll say, what did I do? I ground it up very well. So we'll say it's like fine flour. It's like fine flour. All I mamish have is fine bone dust. She'ein bo etzem kisarna. We'll say now in that case, what don't you have? You don't even have a bone fragment, right? Because remember, what is a bone fragment? A bone fragment is a solid piece of bone. In this case over here, you've ground up all of the bone, and therefore there is no bone fragment at all. Rashi continues, says, "V'kamash malon de'isbe chatzi kav mitame amago v'amaso v'alehilo pachos michatzi kav afilu amago eno mitame lefi she'in bo etzem kisor." So listen to this. So I'll say, so now what the Gemara is teaching is as follows: if you take a half a kav of bones and you grind it up, and you have a half a kav of bone dust, what does that do? That makes you tamei, even to mas oil. Even to masoel. But if you only have a quarter kav of bone dust, what does that do? Nothing. What about etzem kisa, or a bone fragment the size of a barley kernel? Let's say, remember again, etzem kisa only applies when? When you have actual bone. But if all you have is bone dust, ultimately it's not going to convey anything. So therefore I will say, what we are slowly doing, or I just want to point out, is really going ahead and accumulating some really very important halachas. Right? So I will say, so here's what I have. It's either shedra or gilgolas. I don't need both. Right? I also know that halacha l'maisa, again, it's a half a kav of bones that convey tumas, even tumas ohel. Certainly maga, masa, even tumas ohel. I now know also that halacha l'maisa, the half a kav of bones does not even have to be fully intact, even if it's bone dust. Right? It's still going to convey tuma. A quarter kav of bones, if bone dust, will not do anything, but a bone fragment that is the size of a barley kernel will convey tuma. What kind of tuma? Maga and masa. What won't it convey? Ohel. It's just incredible. We're just accumulating this list of facts. Right? Next, Alevra min ames. So now we are Nun Gimel of days 53b, 5 lines in. 5 lines in. So remember again, if you have a limb from a mace or a limb from a chai, from a living person, that have enough flesh. To which the Gemara says, Ein alei and basar. So I will say, by the way, the amount, remember again, what was the amount of flesh? Was the amount of flesh that if it was there, would we be able to regenerate on its own, right? So the Gemara said, so ein alein basakarai. What happens if halacha l'maisa, the limb doesn't have the requisite amount of flesh? So Rabbi Yochanan Amar ein hanazir megalech alein. So Rabbi Yochanan says, okay, if it doesn't have the amount of flesh, doesn't have the amount of flesh, therefore Nazir is not going to have to shave for it. Rish Lakish says hanazir megalech alein. Rish Lakish says no. Even if the limb doesn't have the requisite amount of flesh, the Nazir is still going to go ahead and shave for it. Okay, to which the Gemara Rabbi Yochanan Amar, so let's analyze. Rabbi Yochanan Amar, in hanazir megalech alein. Rabbi Yochanan says the Nazir will not shave because of exposure to this type of limb. The Gemara says, why? The ha katani bereisha al iver min hames bal iver min achai. So ultimately, again, because the Reisha says ultimately, both for exposure to a limb from a living person, a limb from a dead person, sheyeshan kizayis basar in. Aval in alehen lo. So I'll say, so ultimately again, So Rabbi Yochanan is going to say, listen, that's what the Mishnah says, right? The Mishnah explicitly says, when are you going to have to, if you're a Nazir, when are you going to have to shave and restart your Neder Nazirus for exposure to a limb? Only if there is kizayis basar, right? The kizayis of flesh. That's all. If you have it, yes. If you don't have it, no. I have Rabbi Shimon Lakish. What's Reish Lakish's logic? Rabbi Lakish Omer Megaleach Migdalo Katoni B'Seifa. I will say, now here's what's interesting. Here's what's interesting. The Seifa, I will say, the Seifa, which is really what they're referring to, is really the end of the last Mishnah, or the beginning of the next Mishnah, right? Or the next Mishnah. Next Mishnah is really going to focus on cases where if a Nazir is exposed to this type of tumah, the exposure does not require the Nazir to cut his hair and start again. So Reish Lakish makes an interesting observation. You know what's not included in that list? What's not included in that list is a limb that doesn't have a kizayis basar. Interesting. So according to Reish Lakish, if you are not included in the exceptions, then by definition, what? You must be part of the rule. So therefore, again, if an aver, right, if a limb from a mace or from a chai that doesn't have a kizayis of flesh on it, if that's not included in the exceptions list, then by definition, one must be chayiv, or Nazir must become tamei for that type of exposure. That's why Reish Lakish holds that exposure to a limb, even if it doesn't have a kizayis of basar, ultimately, again, is going to cause the need to restart the Neder Naziros. So what Rabbi Yochanan said, Rabbi Yochanan Amar Lacha, no. Kol heicha demasha michlala lo katani b'seifa. I will say, remember again, any case that could be intuitively understood does not need to be explicitly articulated again. So I will say, Rabbi Yochanan's logic is like this. I will say, what did it say in the beginning of the Mishnah? What did it say? That if you have a limb, either from a living person or from a dead person, what did it say? If there's a kizayis basar on it, it conveys tumah from the Nazir. I will say, using our process of thought, what could you extrapolate from that statement? That if it doesn't have a kizayis of basar, it's not metame. Rabbi Yochanan says, Reish Lakish, come on. You don't need a Mishnah to restate that. I will say that's always how halacha works. In other words, you make a statement and you infer something from that statement. So halacha, again, I don't need to restate it again. So chatzi kav atzamos, the mashma chatzi kav in rova atzamos lo. I will say, but use okay. That thing on Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yochanan, one second. The Mishnah said that a Nazir shaves if he is exposed to a half a kav of bones. Now, what can you infer from that? Half a kav of bones, yes. Quarter of a kav of bones, no. Right? That's a pretty logical inference. Yet v'katani b'seifa rov atzamos. Yet Rabbi say that halacha l'maisa. It says in the next Mishnah that what? Exposure to a quarter kav of bones doesn't require the Nazir to shave. So Rabbi Yochanan, so what's going on over here? I understand. So why are you, Rabbi Yochanan? You're saying that the Mishnah, in the list of exclusions, the Mishnah does not need to list anything that can be logically understood from the list of inclusions. So if that's the case, when the Mishnah says that exposure to half a kav of bones requires the Nazir to go ahead and what? Requires the Nazir to go ahead and shave and restart. So that means that exposure to a quarter kav of bones does not require that. Yet, why does it have to say explicitly that exposure to a quarter kav of bones does not require the Nazir to shave? So what's going on? Hasam is different. It's different. Hasam, ilo, v'katani b'seifa rov atzamos. It had to be restated. I'll tell you why. Had the Mishnah not restated that a quarter kav of bones does not trigger the need for the Nazir to shave his head, to cut his hair, Hasa, I would have said as follows: Hava Amina, Afilu al Mago va'al Masaolo. I would have thought that even touching or carrying a quarter kav of bones does not convey tumah. So you say this is actually very interesting. And the Mishnah taught me. Well, again, the Mishnah tells me that exposure to a half a kav of bones causes the Nazir to cut his hair to restart his Neder Naziros. So I'll say, what would I have inferred from that? What's the halacha with a quarter kav of bones? What's the halacha? Doesn't cause tumah. But I would have thought, what does it mean it doesn't cause tumah? Even with maga and masa. I would have thought that even carrying or touching a quarter kav of bones doesn't generate tumah. So I will say, that's false. That's false. Whereas a quarter kav of bones will not create tumas ohel, right? And a quarter kav of bones will not trigger the need for a Nazir to shave his head. Touching or moving a quarter kav of bones absolutely conveys a certain level of tumah. Therefore, again, the Mishnah had to restate it in the list of exclusions to tell us that what is it excluded from? Triggering tumah in a Nazir. What is it not excluded from? Tumah of maga and masa. Therefore, it had to be restated. To teach us that halacha l'maisa is only tumas ohel, that a quarter kav of bones does not convey, but maga and masa absolutely would. The chatzi lug dam, the shamas mina chatzi lug dam in revius dam lo. So again, the Gemara asks, 1 second, Rabbi Yochanan, if you're correct, that therefore the Mishnah doesn't need to restate any exclusion that was explicitly stated in the list of inclusions in the beginning of the Mishnah. In other words, anything that is included, I can logically infer the exclusion without it being explicitly stated. What about a half a log of dam? Right? To say again in our Mishnah now it says exposure to half a log of dam ultimately requires the Nazir to go ahead and shave. Rabbi say, what could I extrapolate from that statement? Less than a half a log of dam does what? Doesn't cause the Nazir to have to shave. To which the Gemara says, "V'katani seifa revius dam." Yet I will say the Mishnah said a revius dam doesn't cause the Nazir to go and have to shave. The Gemara says no, it's different over there. Hasam la'afukim with Rabbi Akiva. I will say over there it's coming to exclude the position of Rabbi Akiva. What does Rabbi Akiva say? Rabbi Akiva revius habdam haba mishnei mesim metame ba'ohel. But I will say there the Mishnah had to restate it. Why? Because there is another opinion, the opinion of Rabbi Akiva. We've quoted this a number of times already. Rabbi Akiva holds that a revius of blood that comes from two corpses does in fact have the ability to convey tumah. Right? Even first of all, say it's a double chiddush. Number one, it's a revius of dam. Number two, even from two different sources. Remember again, what's the tradition of Rabbi Akiva? Va'al kol nafshos meis lo yavo. The plurality of the statement ultimately allows Rabbi Akiva. Therefore, again, the Gemara says, Rabbi Yochanan responds, that halacha l'maisa, you had to restate dam. Why do you have to restate dam? Because dam comes to exclude the position of Rabbi Akiva. Fine. Hi, Avram min ameis, hechi dami. So I'll say, what's the case of Avram min ameis? Id ispei. And I'll say, you know what? We'll stop over here for today. We'll stop over here with Hi, Avram min ameis. Well, again, I'm leaving off mid thought. But again, I'll say we're going to do a little thought on the parsha. But again, what we are leaving off with is a fundamental machlokes in Rabbi Yochanan Reish Lakish, namely about the aver, about the limb, whether it's a limb from a dead person, a limb from a living person. Ultimately, again, the machlokes Rabbi Yochanan Reish Lakish. What happens if it doesn't have a kizayis basar on it? So ultimately, again, Rabbi Yochanan telling me if it doesn't have a kizayis basar, Nazir doesn't have to shave. Reish Lakish saying if it doesn't have a kizayis basar, he still has to shave. They both have their inference from the Mishnah, and what this has done is triggered a more general conversation by the Mishnah, namely again about which items need to go ahead and be included ultimately again in the first Mishnah, the inclusion case and the exclusion case. Meretz Hashem, we'll continue the rest of the Mishnah tomorrow. So just to share with you a short idea in the parasha. Sorry. So I'll say in the beginning of the parasha, again, this week, Baruch Hashem, we have the incredible schos to read the parasha of Vayakel. Sorry, the incredible schos this week in Meretz Hashem to read the parasha of Vayakel Pekudei. And of course, what the Torah does over Rabbi is the Torah reinforces the halachos of Shabbos. Halachos of Shabbos. And of course, again, why the halachos of Shabbos there? Once again, to reinforce the idea that as important as Shabbos is, as important as the building of the Mishkan is, the halachos of the Mishkan, the building of the Mishkan, does not trump the obligation of Shabbos, right? Shabbos is central. Shabbos is core to the nature of the covenantal relationship between Am Yisrael and HaKadosh Baruch Hu. The Mishkan, of course, serves as a meeting point between heaven and earth, and as important as it is, do that work 6 days a week, but Shabbos is Shabbos, and aside from Pikuach Nefesh, right, aside from a threat to life, Nothing else is docha Shabbos. So we'll say, so interestingly enough, so the pasuk therefore says, this is in Parak Lamed Hey Pasuk Gimel, chapter 35, verse 3. Lo sevara ish b'chol shosechem b'yom Shabbos. Do not go ahead and kindle a fire in your home on Shabbos. So I will say, so we know this concept. This phrase ultimately becomes almost like the paradigmatic phrase to teach us the concept of the Isra Malacha on Shabbos. You can't do Malacha. The paradigmatic example of Malacha, of forbidden labor on Shabbos, is Eish, is fire. Now there's a whole discussion in the Gemara about, Torah already tells us that we can't do Malacha on Shabbos. Why single out Havara? Why single out kindling? So Rashi over here already in the pasuk talks about the idea that Havara lechalek yatzasa, lelav yatzasa. Again, we're not going to get into that machlokes. I want to share with you something incredibly beautiful. The Chasam Sofer has a beautiful interpretation on this. The Chasam Sofer says as follows. I want to quote you. He says, "Shebechol yemos hashavua te'eish ha'ava v'advekus ba'eres b'leiv adam meirov isuk batar mitzvos." So I will say, what's the whole chap? The whole avodah of a Jew is ultimately, again, to light the fire of Torah and mitzvos. That's the whole idea, right? The whole idea in life is, why do I learn? Why do I do mitzvahs? Of course, well, why do I learn? Why do I do mitzvahs? Because Hakadosh Baruch Hu told me to learn and to do mitzvahs. But ultimately, again, on a deeper level, what I'm trying to do is light the fire of spirituality. I'm trying to light the fire of ruchnius. I'm trying to light the fire of devekos, of connection to Hakadosh Baruch Hu. That is the entirety of my avodah. Now, I will say, says Chasam Sofer, what's the goal? Ad shebiyom hashabos tehei shal eves libo, ola me'eleha karish ve'ish. Chasam Sofer says, I will say, how do you know if you had a successful week? How do you have had a successful week? If when you come to Shabbos, you're on fire. If on Shabbos the fire is burning, even without it being stoked, right? If on Shabbos the fire is burning, even without me tending to it. If on Shabbos the fire is burning as a result of all of my avodah during the week, ultimately, that's a successful weekday. That's the litmus test of 6 good days if the fire on Shabbos is burning by itself. Lo shekel shavua, shekel be'avei avadim. So I will say, this is interesting. Chasam Sofer says sometimes you make a mistake. We think that like the weekday is for mundane activities and Shabbos is for Kodesh. Right? So the weekday do myself, and then Shabbos is the day that I stoke my fire. The Chasam Sofer says, no, it's just the opposite. During the week, the goal is to stoke the fire so that on Shabbos, it's already burning on its own. Says there was such a different way to look at the week, right? We look at the week as Chol, and Shabbos is Kodesh. Says Chasam Sofer, said, no, every day is Kodesh. And every day requires a stoking of the fire. And every single day requires putting, what do I have to do? I have to put the material, like the logs of Ruchnius onto my fire of spirituality. Every single day I do this. And the goal is put it on Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, so that Shabbos, it's a raging fire. Shabbos, it's already burning. Shabbos is the result of the avodah of my week. Shabbos is not the beginning. Shabbos is the culmination of all my spiritual avodah. And therefore says Chasam Sofer something so beautiful. He says, that's the pshat. Lo sevaru eish b'chol moshosechem yom HaShabbos. Shabbos shouldn't be the day when you kindle your fire of holiness. Shabbos should be the day when you see the result of the fire that you've been kindling throughout the week. Shabbos is a litmus test. How am I doing spiritually? How do I walk into Shabbos? Do I walk into Shabbos inspired because I've spent my week well? Or do I walk into Shabbos totally spent because I have not focused enough on spirituality over the course of the week? Don't kindle anything on Shabbos, says Chasam Sofer, and you'll be able to see how your week went. Chasam Sofer, of course, is not telling us not to devote serious time to our spirituality during the Rebbe, but it's just a different way to view the Shabbos weekday relationship. Again, we often look at the weekday as Chol, and Shabbos is like my spiritual booster. Says Chasam Sofer, no, every day is my spiritual booster. And Shabbos is the day where I can really see how am I doing in life. But I will say, I'll end with this. I think the Chasam Sofer is also teaching us another incredible lesson, which is that if we get ourselves on the right spiritual trajectory, so we're able to develop a momentum, and that momentum is able to move us just memela, right? If I light the fire on Sunday through Friday, that fire remains lit on Shabbos. If we get ourselves into the right behavioral patterns, I get myself into the right habits, I put myself on the right derech, there is a certain spiritual trajectory that continues on. We'll say there's still one day left of the week. Even if we have not yet used Sunday through Thursday in a way to properly fan the flames of spirituality, we should be Zochem Yeretz Hashem to maximize today, to enter into Shabbos with a sense of incredible Hislavos. The fire should already be burning when Shabbos starts, not to start the fire on Shabbos, but to ultimately continue the fire on Shabbos. So we Zochem Yeretz Hashem to put ourselves in the right pattern of behavior, to put ourselves with the right habits, to put ourselves on the right ongoing cycle of spirituality so that the fire is always burning. Good Shabbos.